Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Ghoul Guides Association, the show where we talk about all things Gothic and pop culture and the twisted web that is the Gothic across history. We are, of course, your Ghoul Guides. I'm Lauren.
And I'm Mary.
And today we are going to be taking it right back, rewinding that big old goth clock to something that is at the very heart of the origins of the Gothic. We are going to be talking about chivalry.
Lots of knights and maybe some horses thrown in there. Damsels in distress, maybe.
Yes.
Religious
yes,
war.
Exactly. Oh, hitting the nail on the medieval head.
Spoiler.
Yeah, so spoiler. So today's episode, so this is actually going to be a two-parter. In today's episode, we are going to talk about what chivalry is. Where did it come from? Why the fuck is it a thing? Why is it important? And then in the next part, I'm going to explain why it's actually important to the Gothic. What's the relevant? How does it impact? Is it still relevant to the Gothic today? How, what is chivalry today? So we're going to have a little history lesson over those two episodes. But today I am going to be talking about what the fuck is chivalry and where the fuck did it come from? Because I feel like it's one of those words, things, ethoses, whatever you want to call it, that gets thrown around a lot, and we maybe don't really know exactly what it is or where it comes from. I mean, you already gave us a bit of your idea of what chivalry is there, Mary, but I guess from the other side of the Gothic table, what would you expect? If someone said that something was chivalric or chivalrous or had chivalry, what would you be thinking?
Well, I think a lot of people that maybe aren't familiar with chivalry, either historically or the kind of Gothic version of chivalry, you might remember the phrase "chivalry is dead," which is often it's often about manners, and it's often quite gendered, it's about men being chivalrous to women, which could perhaps just be like opening the door or putting your coat down over a puddle. Yeah, putting your coat down over a puddle so that a woman, doesn't get their feet wet, because we know that when women and girls get their feet wet, then they shrivel up and, become old hags.
We die. We simply die.
Which is, of course, a joke. That does not happen as far as I am aware.
It probably does happen in some sentimental novels.
But I think there is now, like, if you're thinking about like what is a layman's understanding of chivalry, it's very connected to gender narratives and to manners and politeness. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, chivalry, as we think of it today, is very much about a code of behavior. Very gendered, very masculine, and it's about politeness, manners, holding the door open, paying for the bill, being chivalric. And, the age of chivalry is dead. Chivalry is dead is something that you'll hear quite often as a pop culture term. But the first person to lament that chivalry was dead was my personal nemesis, Edmund Burke. So Burke famously or infamously, depending on how you view history, declared in a piece of writing on the execution of the French Queen Marie Antoinette, that chivalry was dead, that the execution of the French monarchy and the true start of the French revolutionary government, not the revolution itself, but the actual, the revolutionary government, meant that chivalry was dead. And a lot of people were like,
can I just say, like, just compare those two things, like chivalry is dead because men aren't holding doors open for you anymore, versus chivalry is dead because we've beheaded the queen. Like,
they chopped Marie Antoinette's head off. And to be fair to Burke, which is not a thing that I am very often, because I hate his dead guts.
That's definitely worse. I'm
yeah. The treatment of Marie Antoinette was horrendous. They accused her of having they accused her of paedophilia. They accused her of having inappropriate sexual relations with her young son, the Dauphin. Whilst she was a pampered rich royal, and whilst I do love Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette movie, that is a revisionist version of history, the way that she was villainized and demonized as a woman was particularly horrendous. So I will give it to Burke. There was some justification in him making that statement. A lot of people disagreed, including Mary Wollstonecraft, and we'll talk a little bit about why that's relevant for the Gothic in the next episode. But why was the French royal family being executed the end of the Age of Chivalry for Burke? What did that mean? Because we think of it, like you said, as manners. So I was going to be like, how does killing a queen mean the end of manners? I think actually that's probably a logical jump you can make. But it goes a lot deeper than that. So what I'm going to do is rewind us all the way back to the 12th century. And once again, this is a very Western concept. Chivalry was at the very heart of the creation of the European dynasties, what would become the European empires. I might even make an argument next time that it's at the root of colonialism. But chivalry is actually something that very much comes up organically. And it literally is derived from the word cheval. Do you know what cheval is in French, Mary?
I don't know. Something to do with horses?
It's literally horse.
Hey, that was a guess. I was expecting to be wrong.
It's literally horse. So yeah, cheval literally means horse, and chevalier literally was the word for the mounted cavalry. So the soldiers, the knights who rode horses were chevaliers, and their martial code came to be known as chivalry. And this is particularly important because the mounted cavalry were the strongest arm of a medieval military. Navies were a thing, but obviously shipbuilding didn't become more advanced until later on, particularly obviously gunpowders, cannons, things like that. If you were going into war in the 1100s, you wanted some fucking guys on horses. Because, otherwise, war is just a bunch of men running at each other at this point, which actually is better than it is now. Let's go back to that. But war is a bunch of men with often long sticks with sharp bits on the end,
just
running at each other.
horses and sticks.
Horses and sticks, literally.
Horses and sticks.
So, of course, if you've got a strong mounted cavalry, if you have got a strong, chivalric faction, you're gonna win that battle because horses, they're fast, strong. It's really easy to if you're running in on a horse and there's a man on the floor, you can stab down. That's a lot easier. I, for a military historian, don't actually know anything about. I'm just realizing this now. I'm like, what's that thing? Is a javelin? No. I am the worst military historia ever.
You're not into the weaponry. You're into the narratives of war.
Couldn't care less.
But if we are, going back and thinking about things in terms of warfare, I think in the 21st century, there has been a massive development in terms of drones and AI in terms of war.
Yes.
If you go back to the First World War, that was very much kind of trench warfare, which is very different to what we're talking about here. And the kind of technologies of war, I guess, have the development of those have increased in the 20th and 21st century, which isn't to say that between the 12th and the 19th century, there weren't any developments, but it was not in the same way. And I guess you had, sometimes you would have big kind of wooden machinery type things, maybe
like
with
seasons.
Yes, but those would be quite
Trebuchets.
bulky. Trebuchets, exactly, is what I was thinking of. You would have those things, but they're big and bulky, and you have to bring them to where you're fighting.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in terms of like the actual like people on the ground and the cannon fodder, I guess.
Well, I was going to say foot soldiers.
It would be, yeah, well, foot soldiers, but also, horses. And if you have a load of people on foot, the next best thing is horses. And the thing about horses is they're very, in a similar way to dogs, they're very amenable to humans. Compared to their, let's get anatomical, compared to their kind of head sizes and their skull sizes, they have relatively small brains, which means that they are, we have brains that fill our skulls. Horses do not have that. I guess because that's how they've been bred, which means that they're quite, for the most part, amenable to being trained. And I guess this is also why, thinking about it from an animal perspective, it's really unfair and it's really cruel. I think this is probably the cruelest aspect of any warfare, and I think we should put that out there as well. That like this, anything that involves horses, which are the primary kind of animals that are used. We can talk about how they are effective, but I think we should also say that they have small brains, they can't really consent in any kind of meaningful way, and it's very, very cruel.
It's, I mean, I could do a whole other episode about the like non-human casualties of war, and I've talked before about like the destructiveness of war outside of the literal battles, and that will be things like landscapes, plant life, ecosystems, but horses are always one of the biggest casualties, and it's fucking devastating. Slightly less so back in, so this kind of dates back to, we start around the 10th, 11th century. And if you think about the 10th and 11th century in Europe, this is the beginning of what we would consider to be like the chivalric age, the medieval kind of heyday in terms of these dynasties of European houses. You've got battles like 1066, you've got things like Agincourt, these battles that will be recreated by men on tables with tiny toy soldiers for years and years to come. And actually, and I say that as someone who dearly loves my friends who fight with little toy soldiers. That these, this style of warfare was very much about like the art of war, and it was very much about, well, we have this many men and this many horses, and you would, like, this is why Napoleon was supposed to be a genius, because he knew how to do tactics like this. As supposed to be. Napoleon technically was a military genius, but that's my opinion. Anyway, stop getting off topic, Lauren. So chivalry literally comes from this idea of the mounted soldier. Now, back in this period of time, you as a king, as a lord, as the head of an army, you didn't go out and buy 60 horses and then see which of your men was best trained on those 60 horses. Your men came with horses. So the mounted soldiers were, by their very nature, the nobles, the rich men, the landed, titled gentry. And what starts to happen essentially is by the 12th century, the mounted cavalryman or chevalier becomes its own class. And this is where knights literally come from. So being a knight was both a profession and a title. If you were born a knight, so if your father was a knight and you had, so you're Sir whatever, and you have a small estate, somewhere, if the king went to war, which kings, particularly in Britain, were wont to do on a very regular basis, in actual fact, around between kind of like the 11th and 14th centuries, pretty much it was a guarantee you went to war in the summer. Because you needed to conquer and pillage and all those other things. But if you were a knight, you literally were expected to go to war. So part of your education, part of your title was this military aspect. So this idea of chivalry has always been just inherently militaristic. It cannot be separated from its military origins because it becomes a code specifically for this noble class of soldier.
Yeah. And I'm sure you will get into this, but also tied to that are ideas of like nation, because what is the military doing? But it is protecting the nation, keeping everyone there safe, and also fighting for glory. Yeah.
And there's that whole thing of like, particularly in Western literature, we've always really loved this idea that the noble peasant, a man of humble origins, can show himself to be brilliant to the king, and the king will grant him title and he'll become a knight. Am I talking about our favorite film?
Literally what happens in A Knight's Tale. Sorry, was that where you were going? Yeah, okay, great.
That for us. Yeah, so I was potentially referencing Heath Ledger's greatest work, A Knight's Tale, mine and Mary's shared favourite film.
Yeah.
Our favourite Heath Ledger film, actually. I think I like it more than 10 Things I Hate About You, but again, that's another conversation for another time. But generally, this is a social class. So the landed gentry... So in the case of England, this is mostly people...
To go back to A Knight's Tale, I think that it really does kind of demonstrate this point in that he pretends to be Sir Ulrich von Liechtenstein. He makes up a knight's kind of identity.
He has his fake patent of nobility.
Yes, after having fought in a battle as his previous master, who was a knight. When they find out that actually he's just a Rufus son, who is a Thatcher's son, who's faked this. Everyone hates it. He's put in stocks. Yeah. Sorry, this is a spoiler for the film, but I mean it came out like in the 90s. So so if you haven't watched it yet, then what are you doing with your life? He's put in stocks because it is such a bad kind of crime. He's transgressed that kind of social code because knights are the highest kind of the only high that you can get is the actual literal like king and royal family. But then the king.
It's the prince.
It's the prince. Yes, it's the Black Prince. But he rocks up.
Who is a very important figure in chivalry.
But he's like, actually, do you know what? I don't care that he pretended to be a knight because he embodies all of the values that a knight should embody. And so I'm going to make you Sir William. It's a very, I think if you want to understand this point about class, transgression of those kinds of class codes, but also the power that the monarchy had,
despite being a purposefully anachronistic comedy action film, it actually gets chivalry and the kind of like fallacy of chivalry and the way that chivalry works in a societal context really, really right. Particularly for like the 14th, 15th centuries.
Yes, because also, I know we'll let you get back to your point, but in terms of like what were the knights doing and their role in warfare and things like that, the I forget his name now because he's not as important as William von Liechtenstein, but the Count Adhemar,
the man that he's like Adhemar.
Yes, Count Adhemar. He fights him at some jousting tournaments, but then Adhemar gets recalled because he needs to go and fight in some wars. And then you see him on the battlefield with his troops. So it is this idea that yes, knights were doing some fun things like jousting tournaments, stuff like that. but when the king wants you to fight for him, then you have to go and do that. Yeah.
Yes, and I will talk about jousting and the reason that was a thing in a moment, because it is really important. But the crux of this first part of this episode is that A Knight's Tale is an amazing film, and if you've not seen it, you need to go and see it. It's truly a masterpiece. What can I say? But so chivalry is very much about tying social class and military identity together. So the top of the military are also the top of the social class. And it starts to bake in this idea that there is something inherent in the noble classes that is lended to chivalry. But what by this point is chivalry? Why does chivalry become the preeminent martial code in early modern medieval Europe? And that is essentially, so we kind of start to have this idea forming out of the 10th century. It's forming in France. I'll talk about why that becomes contentious to Britain later, but it very much comes out of France, as you might imagine, from the term and the origins in the French language. And by the 12th and 13th century, that's when it really starts to take shape. And it becomes particularly present in literature in the early 1200s. So we have an anonymous poem in 1220 called, and again, I say this all the time, but I'm so sorry for my French pronunciation. I speak not a lick of French and for some reason chose a specialist subject that requires me to say French words all the time. So this anonymous poem was called the Oden de Chivalry. And it tells the story of the First Crusade. So the First Crusade was in 1096. And it's telling the story of the king and Saladin and the battles. And it's kind of setting this idea that the European knights, the knights of this, these European coalitions, had these refined qualities. They were polite, they were sensitive, they were educated, but they were also kind and compassionate. They didn't commit violence for the sake of violence. They committed violence for their king, for the protection of their people, for the protection of innocence, and significantly, in the name of God. So the beginnings of the Crusade period, so like I said, the First Crusade is 1096, Second Crusade is 1147, and the Third Crusade is 1184. I think I've written, it might be 89. My 4s and 9s are very similar. There are more Crusades after that, and there are Crusades all across Europe, but those are kind of like the three most significant ones in terms of setting the scene for this. And chivalry becomes really inherent in differentiating between the Ottomans, between the Turks, between the Islamic kingdoms, and the European Christian royals who were invading. Let's be honest, this is an invasion narrative. So to re-establish, essentially, to tell this story of these, white Christian royals going into Islamic lands and committing war, they frame the violence in this way of like, well, this is superior violence because it's backed by God, because, there's stories in these early poems of, you get lots of tales of a knight taking a young Muslim boy as a squire or a servant, or, he wounds his enemy and he takes him in and he drinks with him and they exchange stories and they leave as respected friends, even though they are not allies. But essentially, chivalry starts to become a code. And codes of behaviors are really important because this is the era of feudalism. Mary, do you know what feudalism is?
I do, but you probably have a really snappy definition, so I'm going to let you take this one for the team.
I actually don't have a really snappy, I really should. That should be something that I have one for. Basically, feudalism is your lordships, principalities, little kingdoms. It's all of this kind of whoever has the most men, the strongest horses, the best crops is the one that is in power. And feudalism was kind of, even at this point in time, starting to be seen as at odds with Christian values, with early ideas of art and culture, because it's essentially about, in the winter, you go back to your estate, you bed down, you get through the winter, and then in the summer you ride out and you conquer your neighbors.
So I actually, You've just reminded me of something. I was reading something recently, and it was comparing our kind of contemporary Western moment. I think it was specifically talking about what's happening in the UK and America and some kind of European countries, but looking at the renting crisis, because that's what it is, right? The renting and the housing crisis. And it said basically we have gone back to a period of feudalism where you have these few people who function as like barons who own large swathes of property, and you are their tenant. And it's very much that kind of like feudal system where there's so few houses available to rent affordably or to buy, because they've all been consumed and taken and all this kind of stuff by a small number of people. And it's that kind of system where you have essentially a kind of hierarchy of people that then have this kind of like area that's almost like theirs, and people pay them money.
Yeah, that actually has a name. It's called neo-medievalism or neo-feudalism. I actually talked about it a little bit in my Margaret Atwood chapter for you. But yeah, it's generally called neo-medievalism. But yeah, it's essentially like this system of liege lords and resource domination. If you have more resources, you are more powerful. And even though we are in a period of what is technically an absolute monarchy, we are now in a period of time where kingdoms are becoming bigger. So, for example, with England, there is a king of England, whereas previously, England, in the earlier medieval period, England is in lots of separate, different kingdoms. With like, so this obviously is the story of Alfred the Great, unifies the kingdoms. But even then, if a duke or a lord of somewhere, he's the one with all the horses and the grain and the people, he kind of has almost more power than the king, because the king needs him on side, because the king needs him to go and fight his war for him. So it's this very kind of like, the idea is it's an unfair, undemocratic, unregulated system. And it is very much based on going out and taking from other people. Either becoming allies or literally going and being like, this is mine now, I've taken it. So chivalry evolves to essentially soften feudalism. And this is where the early idea of the Gothic comes in. You've heard us talk about this before. The Goths were the barbarians that were responsible for the fall of Rome. And through this period of time, so in the medieval period, Gothic means barbaric. It means bloodthirsty, barbarous, uncivilized, impetuous. So these early European kingdoms, and when I say early, I mean in terms of modern history, they're in no way early. But these early European kingdoms need something to set themselves apart, to say, yes, I rode all my horses into your small country and I killed all your men and I took your crown and your resources, but I am chivalric and God loves me, and therefore I'm not a barbarian and it's fine. So chivalry...
I was just going to say, it's that idea of glory, like, which I think is such a weird and stupid thing. But we have done all of this violence, for the glory of God, and all of this bloodshed and murder and pillaging and sexual violence has been done for a greater reason, for glory,
because
for honor.
And because most of these kings believe that they are king because God wants them to be king. And if God wants you to be king, then surely he wants you to be king of everywhere, not just your little island or your little country. The problem is, all the kings of Europe think that they are the chosen Christian king. So sometimes they team up against one of the others, and sometimes they fight each other. It's usually England fighting France, but sometimes they do team up together, for example, in the First and Second Crusades. But essentially, France starts to develop chivalry, and the other European nations start to borrow it. Around about the early 14th century, so in the early 1300s, you start to get people like, I think it's Geoffrey de Charnay, who was a French scholar and historian. So a lot of this already is looking backwards. So the Ordre de Chivalry is in 1220. It's telling a story from 100 years to 50 years before. Geoffrey de Charnay is talking about things that happened 100 to 200 years before. So they're already starting to use the past as a qualifier for the present and the behaviors of the present. But writers like de Charnay start to outline what the rules of chivalry were. Now, sometimes these, I haven't listed them because it's kind of ambiguous. They're mostly unwritten rules. It's not like somebody said, here's the 10 commandments of chivalry. Well, somebody did, but not until like 1884. But the idea was that chivalry was the antidote to the violence of feudalism. Chivalry was courtly, it was noble, it was mannered, it was, all of the things that we would kind of think about from sensibility in the later 18th century. So chivalry is very much a military code that not only dictates how you behave on the battlefield, so you don't kill wantonly, you are not to be brutal, you are to respect. And it's all about respect as well. If you meet someone on the field and they are not as talented as you, you don't glory in killing them. You just do what you have to do to win that fight. But if you meet someone who is your equal, you're meant to sort of almost relish that military engagement and respect them, even though you're on the other side, but you're justified in murdering them because you're fighting for a good cause, supposedly. So it is very much a military code of behavior, but it then transfers into court life. You are supposed to be a good liege lord. So you are supposed to treat your tenants well, treat your servants well, treat your wife well, treat your daughters well, educate your sons, take on, a lot of these liege lords would take on wards. Now that's often because there's a high death rate amongst children. So you needed a son and he needed a squire and he needed a valet and all of those types of things. But often it would be, you get a lot of stories of somebody taking the son of their enemy as a prisoner of war and raising them as a ward in their home. So it's all about the way that you behave as a lord. And this is to kind of counteract that idea that within feudalism, there's absolutely nothing stopping you from just popping over to your neighbours, nicking all his chickens, taking his wife for your own and setting the whole place on fire. Because why shouldn't you? That's what feudalism is essentially permitting. But chivalry doesn't permit that. And it also starts to build this idea that within men, there is a unchecked passion, that men are naturally aggressive and naturally rough. So you need something to temper those passions. And you mentioned this earlier. Do you know what it is?
Oh, what did I mention earlier?
Jousting.
No. Jousting. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So jousting, so essentially, round about this time, you start to get tourneys. And this is what the film A Knight's Tale is all about. But you also see this if you've watched Game of Thrones. Yeah. During peacetime, you have tourneys. And tourneys were very important because not only did they maintain military training throughout peacetime, it was a good way of seeing, who was better than whom. It was a good way to win the king's favor, but it was also seen as being a way to make sure that, this guy who's really great at killing people on the battlefield, let's let him run at other men with a big stick on a horse, so that when we're at peace, he doesn't get bored and go and kill his neighbor or decide to, do a coup.
It really reminds me of, cats, especially indoor cats, when they
yes.
don't, when they get the zoomies, and it's like you're meant to like give them attention and play with them and give them space to run around, because otherwise they get all this pent up energy and then they go a bit wild. And it's like, that's what it's reminded me of. Just
yeah, I mean, it's basically that.
But yeah, and I mean, A Knight's Tale is just so quotable. But yeah, it's just,
just silly,
a boy
on a horse
silly little boy with the stick. Yeah, on a horse with the stick.
It's a lance. Down.
I quote from that movie I'm not even exaggerating, on a weekly basis, and Craig sometimes gets annoyed with me.
I still sing the song all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a brilliant film. You can't go wrong with it. And it actually, if you've listened to this episode and you're like, oh, I'd like to see Chivalry in action, that's just watch A Knight's Tale. That is my film recommendation for this episode. So basically, chivalry. By the 15th century, chivalry is a military code of behavior that seeks to guide noble soldiers, because again, like I said, to be a chevalier, to be a cavalryman, to be a knight, you have to be rich, because you have to have a horse, and horses were really, really expensive. You had to have a title.
Think now that horses still are really expensive.
Horses are still expensive.
The upkeep for them, they're big animals, and you need to make sure that they have somewhere safe to like live and sleep. They do need exercise. So you need a big space and ground. So you can't just keep one in your garage. But they also eat a lot. So they are expensive, and especially if you're wealthy, you will have a lot of horses. Because you
usually would have a liveryman, you'd have stables, you'd have a squire. All knights had a squire. Sometimes that would be a younger cousin, or somebody from a vassal family, so somebody who wasn't as high status as you but was still noble, and they would be your squire. This is the system, essentially. So chivalry comes to be this masculine code of behavior, and within this masculine code of behavior, 3 things are important: war, religion, and courtly manners. Because one of the things that chivalry also does, as a way to, temper and control masculine violence, but also male behavior, is it kind of centers the protection of innocence. So this is young people, this is poor people, this is children, this is those who are physically disabled. You were supposed to care for all of those people, take them into your estate, look after them. But it also centers women. You were supposed to defend and protect women. Women still, and have always been, the symbol of national identity, the symbol of often purity, but sometimes also the symbol of religious grace and religious goodness, particularly in the Christian tradition. So that's where we kind of get these 3 aspects. You were meant to be not only a kind and compassionate soldier, but a really, really good soldier. The idea was that chivalry, the most chivalric soldiers, the most chivalric knights, were also the most talented. So chivalry is very much connected to martial superiority and martial brilliance. It's also a way of informing your conduct. How do you take prisoners of war? How do you treat the defeated? How do you treat people that you've conquered? How do you treat your men? So this idea that, like with squires, that's a training position. So if you've got a squire, you need to be a good role model for your squire so that he goes on to be a good knight. But you're also a Christian soldier, so at all times you need to be embodying Christian virtues, Christian morality, acting in the name of God. But you also need to be a member of the court. Being a knight, you are also a member of the king's court, and you need to show courtly grace and courtly manners. And that was most literally represented by the protection of innocence. And this is where you get the damsel in distress trope. Mm-hmm. So this idea that, if you were a knight and you went to your neighbours and you realised that his daughters and his wife look really unhappy, and you think he's maybe, not treating them properly, you were supposed to do something about that. So it's kind of this is where I have to say, chivalry develops for the right reasons. Chivalry develops as a way to put morality and goodness and order into a system like feudalism that is fundamentally violent and disordered. It, of course, has lots of problematic patriarchal, colonial aspects to it, but I will admit it starts for okay reasons.
Because once you start to take those ideas of order, and especially when you think about them colonially and in the way that, British and European armies were invading other countries and rescuing.
But they did it nicely.
Rescuing all those damsels in distress. Mm-hmm. It then has, not even just undertones, but it does embody a lot of what we would consider to be racism and colonial.
Right back at the end of the 11th century with the First Crusade, we have the beginnings of Orientalism and we have the origins of European colonialism, because it is very much tied to this idea that the European Christian, the Western European Christian way of being is superior. It is God's will. And therefore, by invading, by committing this violence, by forcing, conversions, forcing this agenda, essentially, you are doing God's will. So literally from the earliest, you cannot untie chivalry from these early colonial patriarchal values. And it can never not be militaristic, because it very much only exists to be a code of behavior for soldiers. So that's where we're at with chivalry. So by the kind of 1400s, we're looking at a system that is all about essentially glorifying and prettying up military masculinities, but it also starts to become romanticized. So this is where we start to get the literature. And of course, that's why most of you are here. So we get 3 specific types of chivalric romances. And I'm talking romances with a small r, not with a big R, but they called it romance for this reason. So when we say chivalric romances, what we're talking about is usually epic poems, sometimes plays. Prose wasn't really a thing at this point. It's mostly poetry. And they were divided into 3 categories. Again, this is a French form. Britain borrows it / appropriates it. And this is where we start to get the romances that we think of with the knight in shining armor, the damsel in distress, stories like St. George and the Dragon. They fit into this idea of the chivalric romance. So this is the big literary form. And it fits into 3 genres. There is warrior chivalry, religious chivalry, and courtly love chivalry. So stories like Tristan and Isolde, for example, are courtly love chivalry. Now, those genres can interlink, and sometimes there will be multiple installments to an epic poem, and one will be warrior, one will be courtly love, one will be religious, things like the stories of the search for the Holy Grail. Of course, this is when, if you're thinking about the period of the Crusades, a lot of these stories are crusade stories. And this is also where we start to get the inclusion of things like the Knight Templar. And I have specifically not made any notes on the Knights Templar because I'm not going to go into it. We will do a separate episode of it. But the Knights Templar and this idea of orders of knights, and that within these orders of knights, they have, like special missions, or they are particularly known for a certain thing. Chivalry starts to become a strong generic trope in the 14th and 15th centuries. And that is solidified in 1485 with Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, which is a Middle English rewriting of the stories of King Arthur. Now, King Arthur has been a significant figure throughout this early medieval British literature. And as soon as these stories of chivalry start to become important, they start linking kings like Henry II or Prince Henry the Young or the Black Prince, to these older chivalric stories. This is where we get Gawain and the Green Knight. This is where we get the Grail Chronicles. But Thomas Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur really solidifies the canonic Arthur. It's hugely popular. It becomes kind of like the chivalry text. And I think it really symbolizes the kind of culmination of the period. Like I say, 1485, we are approaching the early modern, we're creeping towards Enlightenment, and chivalry will change after that point on what we think chivalry is as we approach the Renaissance. Because when we get into the Renaissance, feudalism can no longer be tolerated. And if feudalism can no longer be tolerated, then what about chivalry? How does chivalry exist without feudalism? We do still get some texts, though. There are texts throughout the 16th century, the most famous of which comes right at the end with Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, a multiple-part epic poem first published in 1590 that blends all three of those chivalric genres together. It's very much inspired by Le Morte d'Arthur, but it adds a much stronger Christian and supernatural flair to it. But it is one of the greatest, most significant stories of chivalry told in the English language. And of course, we are into what we would consider the modern English language rather than early or Middle English. So that's kind of where we're going to leave it today, with where chivalry is, what chivalry is, and where it comes from. I realise we've talked for half of this episode about A Knight's Tale. I maintain that was actually incredibly relevant to the point.
No, it absolutely was, because if you are wanting a kind of, a refresher on what all of these things are, how jousting ties to the military, the importance of class, the importance of the royal family to knights, the kind of the standing of knights in society, then I think actually A Knight's Tale has all of that stuff.
Because this is the thing, like as I was saying earlier, it become to be chivalrous is kind of like, you can only be chivalrous if your social class allows you. And there's very much this idea that if you are not of that knighthood class, if you are not noble, if you're not gentry, how can you be chivalric? Because it starts that idea of good breeding.
Right, but this is the crux of what the Black Prince does when he makes William a knight, in that he says that his historians and his personal researchers have discovered that he is connected to royal lineages, and that it is beyond contestation. So, there's this idea that, one, in order to make this random Thatcher's son a knight, we have to connect him to this royal lineage. But also if you think, well, surely he's making it up, which, obviously. But like his word was such that, again, because the royal family are ordained by God, and you have that divine right of kings. Yes, he's not king yet, but he is going to be, which means
he never does become king.
Well,
he
sure,
dies.
But he still has that. He still has that kind of, that magic power that says, I make this person a knight.
Yeah.
But he still has to create this narrative, and it's that whole. I think. It's
and
great, and it's also, I think also what A Knight's Tale does, and it's similar, I guess, to what things like The Faerie Queene does, is that it takes these ideas of chivalry, and obviously A Knight's Tale is based on Chaucer and Chaucer's works, kind of. A bit.
It's inspired by the Canterbury Tales, but it kind of directly takes from the chivalric romances.
Yes, but what
noble peasants is a really popular trope.
Yeah, but that's exactly what these stories are doing, just hundreds of years apart, which is taking what you said, these concepts of chivalry, and making it into an entertaining narrative.
Exactly. So we have, in short, in a nutshell, so that we know where we're picking up next time, we have a military code of behavior that evolves out of the prominence of mounted cavalry being the the superior arm of a military unit, being literally the thing that would win you a war, being, you know, the social class. So it goes from military to social class to a behavior and a personality, a masculinity in particular that you would aspire to. It starts to become romanticized, and even as it's happening and developing, historicized. The chivalric poems are telling of things that happened 100 years before. They're telling stories of King Arthur. You start to get these supernatural elements, you know, slaying dragons and monsters and giants. And you can probably already see where the Gothic is coming into this. But basically, by the end of the 16th century, chivalry is starting to be outdated. Feudalism is no longer the hot government style in Europe. And where does that leave chivalry, and what happens to chivalry when we move into the 17th and 18th centuries? So that's where we're going to leave it. We're going to pick up next time with my bestie, Richard Hurd, and his letters on romance and chivalry, how that inspired Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto, and how we end up with a Gothic genre that is heavily inspired by chivalry as a genre of poetry. So I hope that all made sense. We will be back next time with more. But if you have obviously any questions or any suggestions, if you do want that Knights Templar episode, then you know where to find us. You can answer the poll on Spotify, drop a comment on YouTube, email us at ghoulguides666@gmail.com, messages on BLUESKY or the forbidden social media that was formerly known as Twitter.
And it's still known as Twitter.
I hope you found this informative, Mary.
I really enjoy this. And, you know, I started this episode being like, I'm really excited to learn about chivalry from Lauren because it's not my subject area. And then I was like, oh, and I love A Knight's Tale. What am I talking about? And then, yeah.
Yeah. Well, as Ken said in the Barbie movie, patriarchy is a lot less interesting when you find out it's not all about horses. But back then, it was all about horses. Just not anymore.
Yeah.
And on that note, we will say goodbye. We'll see you next time. Stay safe and stay spooky.
Stay safe and stay spooky.